As a seminary student studying to become a college chaplain, Price Grisham followed some valuable advice. 10 minutes before turning out the light, read something you want to read, which was Jane Austen. When he discovered that Austen's great-uncle, Oxford University's vice-chancellor, had tossed the popular clergyman, George Whitefield, from campus, the resulting master's thesis on Austen and the 18th century Anglican Church not only bumped up his GPA considerably, but it also resulted in 2 television interviews and 3 award-winning essays sponsored by the Jane Austen Society of North America. Do we have any of the Jane Austen Society members here tonight? As well as a published short story and a request to present a paper on the topic at the Chawton House Library in England. A few months ago, Lauren, my coworker who's not here tonight, she went with me to Hamilton Run, and we had the pleasure, we kind of went to scout Price out. And that is how it came to be. We were enthralled with his presentation, found it, and I hope that you will enjoy it too. But I also discovered that day afterwards, in Lauren's asking him some questions, she mentioned that the evening book club was going to read Pride and Prejudice. And it was through Price that we found out it was going to be in July, the 200th anniversary of Jane's death. And that is how we came up with this fun theme of Jane Austen Month. I'm seeing a lot of repeat visitors, the feedback has been great. Thank you so much for making our Jane Austen Month at Langley Adams a huge success. And who knows, we've got some other things up our sleeve, like Sherlock Holmes. Coming in October. But we'll talk about that later. I gave you all bookmarks, it's on there. So without further ado, a nice round of applause for our special guest today, Price Grisham.
Well, I heard comments going around the room that it was a little warm in here. Hopefully I won't be circulating hot air and making it warmer. I sometimes do pulpit fill-in for my church, and everybody says, yeah, it was a lot warmer in the sanctuary after I was done. Sue was saying, one of the interesting things about this very month is that it is the 200th anniversary of the death of Jane Austen. And not only are we noting that fact, the Bank of England is noting that fact, because Charles Darwin was kicked off the £10 note and they put Jane Austen there instead. And that in itself has developed a little controversy, which we'll discuss when we get to that point. But let's see, can we do some lights there?
There's that better?
Yeah, that's
Might be
better.
cooler too. Okay, we have, hold on, we have a couple more coming here.
Okay, we have a couple more, so I'll save my real big spiel for just a few minutes for that.
I've got one chair here and one right behind, if that's okay. I'll take you up here.
Front row Baptist, here they come.
I can bring another chair over, actually. Actually, I can just bring another chair. I'll just make, that's it. I'm going to sit next to me for here. There you go. We can be accommodating. I needed to grab a chair for myself. Thank you. One more person's coming. Okay.
Alrighty, well, now, it's always good to put things in context. As my ancient Greek teacher, he taught ancient Greek, he himself was.
He was not an ancient Greek.
And the examiner said, context is king. Context is king. And that's very true, regardless of what field you're studying, you should always look at things in context. And so, to place things in context, how much was £10 worth in 1817? In 1817, a tenner was worth approximately £896, or a little over $1,000 today. Thus, Mr. Darcy's £10,000 per year income from his estate was worth well over $1 million per year. Per year. No wonder Mrs. Bennet nearly fainted. I mean, you know, her daughter was about to become a millionairess several times over. So, let's look just briefly at the progression. Since Mr. Darwin was kicked off the £10 note, we won't insult him by calling it the evolution of the £10 note. But let's look at the progression of the £10 note here. Now in 1938, this is what a £10 note would look like. And in 1938, right as World War II was breaking out, a year later it would, this is what the £10 note looked like. And it was worth £470, which maybe was approximately $600. If you at least in modern transitioning, if you want to take your pounds and turn them into dollars, a pound is worth approximately now about $1.50, give or take. It fluctuates so much. When I'm over there, I always just estimate $1.50. So this is what the £10 note looked like just as World War II was breaking out, or about to break out. Then they began putting famous English citizens on the pound note. And the only other woman to appear on the £10 note, other than the Queen herself, is Florence Nightingale. She was on the £10 note in 1975. I believe when I made my first visit to England in 1989, I still saw some of these notes. Then in 1992, we had Mr. Dickens. And in 2000, there's Mr. Darwin. And we can see, you know, just like, you know, the poor old £10 note goes from £94 currently worth in 1975 to 1992. The £10 note was worth about £19 today. And then in 2000, the £10 note was worth about £15 today. And now this is what the £10 note in England will look like pretty prominently as of about 3 days ago. They released this note in Winchester at the cathedral or minster, Winchester Minster, where she is buried. And I have a student that I mentored at Gordon College who is a member of Asperger's or Us, and they're doing a sort of a European tour. And Jack Hankey was in England, and I pleaded with him to please get me one of these notes, but they weren't in wide distribution or circulation yet. They were only just in Winchester as of a couple days ago. So another student has gone over to be with the Gordon College drama team, and he has promised to bring me one back. So in future lectures, I'll have a chance to pass around this note, and you'll be able to see what it looks like and what it feels like, because they're not made out of paper. They're made out of a polymer, a very thin sort of papery plastic. Australia first began putting its currency out in polymer in 1995. And in England, the £5 note recently came out in polymer, and now the £10 note is going to be in polymer. But there's some controversy there because the notes are not biodegradable, although they are recyclable. I think they make park benches out of them or something. And they're very, very thin, but since they're made out of this plasticky type of substance, they will stick together. And you could be handing over 2 notes to the clerk at the grocery store instead of 1. So the Bank of England has been telling its patrons not to fold their currency because that causes them to stick together and you could be spending twice as much money unintentionally as you need to be doing. The other thing that has caused some controversy, other than Jane Austen's actual portrait on there, and we'll be getting to that in just a bit, look at the quote at the bottom of the note, which says, "I declare after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." Now, a big gold star for whomever can tell me which character said that, and your hint is it was in Pride and Prejudice.
Is that Mary?
No, but that's a good guess. Well, the controversy and the unintentional irony, which I'm sure Jane Austen would have delighted in because she was, first and foremost, she was a satirist. She was not a romance writer. So this is when I tell all my teenage friends who are girls, not my teenage girlfriends. And I tell them that Jane Austen was not a romance writer, and it's not all about Mr. Darcy and parasols and servants. They think I'm crazy. But what I'm trying to do, I'm really on this crusade to try and increase the male readership of Jane Austen. Because all through the decades, she's been very, very popular with male scholars until about 25 years ago. She became popular with the general public, and she suddenly became known as a women's writer. And every book by or about Jane Austen that you pick up will be bound in pink. I guarantee it. But at any rate, I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading, was said by, and this is where the unintentional irony comes in, it was said by Miss Bingley, by Caroline Bingley.
Oh, yeah.
They're in the drawing room
Yes.
at the estate there, and she's trying to catch Mr. Darcy's eye. So she picks up the second volume of the book he's reading, which of course won't make any sense because it's the second volume. She hasn't read the first volume anyway. So she's trying to show how intellectual she is by reading. Where you have Elizabeth Bennet in the meantime, who is actually interested in reading,
Sorry.
who is absorbed in her book.
Don't worry.
So the irony here is
Just go around.
Miss Caroline Bingley actually didn't like to read. And I guess whomever in the Bank of England decided to put that quote on the bottom of the note had never read Pride and Prejudice. Otherwise, they would have never put this quote on the bottom of the 10-pound note because it was said by a woman in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice who was very shallow and didn't like to read. And she just said that to try and get Mr. Darcy's attention. So there's some strong unintentional irony there. I really think a better quote would have been the one at the top there. Single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor. Jane Austen would have been floored to think that she would one day show up on the 10-pound note. Because, remember, back in the day of Jane Austen, the 10-pound note was worth a little more than $1,000, which for her was a lot of money. The interesting thing about the Austen family is they were connected with wealthy people all over the place. Both sides of the family had wealthy connections. But Jane Austen and her family were not wealthy. You might get that impression because even in her letters, she will talk about having a domestic staff. But back then, people did have a domestic staff unless you were absolutely dirt poor. You managed to hang on to 1 or 2 servants. And that's because they had no electrical appliances back then. So if you want to calculate how many servants you would have today, just count the number of appliances in your house, and that's how many servants you would probably have had back then. Let's move along here, and in October, they're actually coming out with a Jane Austen £2 coin. I just found that out as I was doing my research. So I have another student, I have students all over the place, but I have another student who has promised me he's going to be there for a year at Oxford as part of the exchange program, and he's going to get a request tomorrow through Facebook to please bring me one of those coins. So that's what it'll look like. I think it's a kind of nice looking coin. The thing about British currency is that a lot of it is going over to coinage now. They've had a pound coin for years. They got rid of the pound note, the single pound note, I believe about 1988 or so. I mean, I went over in '89, and you could still see a few paper pound notes, but you don't ever see those anymore. They have pound notes, they have, pound coins, they have £2 coins. I believe they're even thinking about putting out a £5 coin. But you see, the thing is, the more these coins are worth, the bigger and the heavier they get. So my best friend in seminary was an Englishman. He and his wife have both graduated from Cambridge University in England, and I would go and visit them occasionally. And Jenny said it was so frustrating that they were doing that with the money because my friend Nick would just sort of shove his coins down his pocket, but they were so heavy that they would break through the stitching, and he literally would lose his money through a hole in his pocket. And she kept stitching up the bottom of his pockets, and his pockets kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so we finally came up with a solution. Have you seen these coin purses that are shaped like half moons, where you can you pull them open and it forms a tray that you slide your coins out in? If you're going to England anytime, that's the perfect thing to get, as well as try to pick up a very wide wallet, because if you try and put English notes in an American wallet, what you'll quickly discover is that English currency comes in different sizes. And so the larger the denomination, the wider the bill is. And they're also different colors. British people over here can't tell a $100 bill from a $1 bill because they're all the same color and they all are the same size, you know. But over there, if you try and put, say, a 20 or a 50-pound note in an American wallet, it's wide and it'll stick out. So if you are planning a trip to England at any point, try and find yourself a super cheap wallet at Walmart or someplace that's kind of on the wide side. And that will help you get through your visit without your money sticking out and everybody thinking that you're a rich American. There's one reason I've discovered why I think all English people think all Americans are rich. And it's because we tip 20%. And in England, a lot of times the tip is included with the meal, or if it's not included with the meal, British waitstaff get paid at a full minimum wage. And so tipping is not unheard of there, but it's not at 20%. You might tip 10%, something like that. So because we go over there and we tip 20, 25%, they just think everybody's as rich as blazes over here. And I discovered that when I applied for PhD work at Oxford, and they told me, "We love what you're going to do. This is going to be wonderful." I said, "Do you have any scholarship money?" And they said, "Not for Americans." Because we're all rich. So they're like, no, I'm the exception, believe me, you know, they didn't know them. So, now, another controversy about the Jane Austen portrait. On the £10 note is that that's not really what she looked like. They took, I guess back in the late 1800s, her nephew had a memoir published of his aunt, Jane Austen. And he wanted an illustration. The only authenticated portrait of Jane Austen is a rather bad sketch that her amateur artist sister did. And so he took that and he plumped her up and he prettied her up so that she looked like a pretty Victorian matron. That's not really what she looked like. But if you want to see a little bit about what her family looked like, this is what some of her family looked like. Now, here is an interesting little factoid. This is the Reverend and Mrs. George Austen. Her father was a clergyman in the Church of England. Now, if you read Austen carefully, you will detect that many times she'll use the phrase serious subjects. This does not mean algebra or calculus. What this means is religion. So when she says that her little sister Lydia, you know, the woman is weeping at the time because her sister has run off with, not Willoughby, the other one.
Wickham.
Wickham, yes, thank you. So Lydia's run off with Wickham, and they're eloping. They're going to be living in sin without the sanction of marriage. People do it all the time now, but back then, and I can remember even in my lifetime, back in the early 60s, when I was tiny little baby, or not far from that, if a lady was living without her husband, she got talked about. So until fairly recently, it was kind of a scandal still. You can imagine what a huge scandal it would have been in 1817. So Elizabeth Bennet is weeping copiously because her sister's reputation is ruined. Their reputations are ruined. Her sister's reputation, even though her sisters are as pure as the driven snow, their reputation is ruined by association. So, in that particular passage, Elizabeth Bennet tells her uncle, because her uncle says, well, surely your sister can't have done this. How could she have been so thoughtless? How could she do this and realize the ruin that she was bringing down on the family? And Elizabeth Bennet says, I know it is shocking to think that a sister could do this, but she's young, she's thoughtless, and she's not been brought up in serious subjects. Religion. And so, as a result of Lydia not paying attention to her religious instruction, Austen is saying, she has this problem. So, the interesting thing, the other interesting little factoid about Pride and Prejudice is, does anybody remember the book of sermons that Lydia can't stand? Fordyce's Sermons. Remember Fordyce's Sermons? Well, Jane Austen probably didn't like those either because I've read through them and they're boring and they really want women to be very submissive and never say anything or do anything. But the irony is that Lydia Bennet herself is exactly the kind of girl that Reverend Fordyce is warning against. If you don't pay attention to your Sunday school lesson, this is the sort of girl you'll turn into. You'll be a man chaser and you'll be silly. And so Jane Austen is using a little bit of her own irony there to say that there were one or two points that Reverend Fordyce was making that maybe she agreed with, but she certainly didn't agree with the way that he presented it. And why would she agree with him in point, but not in communication? It was because she was the daughter of the Reverend George Austen. The Reverend and Mrs. George Austen. They are in what was known as silhouette. And the silhouettes were invented in the middle of the 18th century. They're named after a Frenchman whose name was Silhouette. There you go. And it was during a time when things were really difficult for all the classes in France. It was right before the Revolution. And so they came up with this way of having mementos where you wouldn't have to actually sit down and have your portrait painted. And silhouettes became, even though they were so affordable, they were very, very elegant and in some ways almost more realistic than some paintings of the period. And the artists would cut them out in very fine detail, and they would even add white or gold or yellow brushwork to sort of highlight that detail. Let's see here. Now there is the Reverend George Austen. As a young man, he was known as the handsome vicar because he was very handsome. And he captured the heart of Cassandra Lee, who was from a prominent family in Oxford. Again, these two folks were fairly well connected, but they were not wealthy themselves. George Austen was able to get into Oxford because one of his ancestors was the founder of St. John's College. And so he was able to go there for free. Now, not only women were restricted in what they could do back then, but if you were a man and you were of a certain class, if you were the younger son of the estate owner, or if your family had been well-to-do in the past, but you had no money now, there were only three things you could do. If there were three fields into which you could go. You could go into the law, you could go into the military, and if you were too dumb for the law, and you were too weak physically for the military, guess who got you? The church. This is why in the 18th century, Wesley and Whitfield and all of these clergy, there was this huge revolt in the Church of England by the evangelicals who were saying, enough of these idiots in the pulpit, that contributed a lot to the evangelical revival in the Church of England. George Whitfield, I'll just add parenthetically, was one of the most famous clergymen. He was one of the most famous celebrities of the day. This man preached 3 times a day for 30 years. He had these huge outdoor presentations and preachings because the small sanctuaries couldn't hold the thousands of people that would come to hear him.
Wow.
So when he died 30 years later, everybody in America and everybody in England had heard of this man. He was sort of like the Billy Graham of his day. Well, he was over here when he kicked the bucket. And guess where this man is buried? You get a real big star if you know this. He was preaching in Newburyport.
Oh, come on.
And he keeled over, or actually he got through the sermon, he was going up the stairs and he keeled over there. And as a result, he's buried in the big old Presbyterian church, Presbyterian meeting house there on, is it School Street? Yeah, he's buried in the basement. Yeah, I mean, you can actually go down and, it's sort of, there are cobwebs and there's a naked light bulb and, there used to be a model of a skull sitting there that they had taken. It all looked kind of creepy, but I mean, he's right there. And he actually is the clergyman whom Jane Austen's great uncle tried to throw off the campus of Oxford because the uncle erroneously thought that Whitfield was trying to get the students to leave the Church of England, which is not true. But anyhow, Jane Austen's great uncle threw him off campus anyway. And so there was a big controversy all over that. And in Jane Austen's family, you can see the theological controversy of the day appearing because one of her brothers became an evangelical clergyman and the other brother became a Church of England clergyman. So, there's the Reverend George Austen. Here he is again, about 1800. He died in 1805. And when he passed away in 1805, the women in the family were left fairly destitute because there was no social security in those days. And that is why a lot of times in situations similar to George Austen's, if you were a clergyman, you see, you were in one of the 3 accepted socially professions. So if you were a clergyman, you had to have gone to either Oxford or Cambridge, which meant that you probably had nice manners, you were articulate, you were well educated, and so you could interact with the people who lived on the estate. You were socially accepted into the drawing room and into the ballroom, even though you might have been as poor as dirt, where your wealthy neighbor who was a merchant who made his money through dirty work was not socially accepted to the gentry and the aristocracy. And so that's why many clergymen stayed, even though they could have made more money by going into business, they decided, or by teaching, they decided to stay as clergymen because that gave their children visiting rights and social acceptance on the estate. And so if you were a clergyman's daughter, it was quite possible you could marry a younger son or even an older son and be well off, and then you can take care of your family. It sounds drastic, but that's what the times were like then. Here is the St. Nicholas Rectory and Church in Steventon, England. This was the Austen family church and rectory. That's where Jane Austen grew up. This is the 12th century. That means this church was built in 1100. Wow. 1100. It's very simple inside. There's some frescoes that are very, very old. I'm not sure if they had, I think by Jane Austen's time they had pews, but not always. You know, when the church was first built, you went in there during your worship time and you stood up. Hopefully the services weren't too long. But that is in Steventon, which is in the county of Hampshire. Now, her older brother became a clergyman, and he was the one that became a traditional Church of England clergyman. And he was born in 1765, died just a couple of years after his sister did, and was also, along with her father, her older brother, was very, very influential in teaching his sister French, Italian, introducing her to great literature. The Austen family didn't have this gender hang-up. They had 6 children. All of the children were brilliant, intelligent, and lively. Part of the reason that they may have not gotten much financial attention from their wealthy relatives is because they all seemed to be having such a good time. And the women were very good at sort of stretching the dollar, making sure the clothes were acceptable for the occasion and so forth. And it's possible that their relatives didn't realize how very bad off they actually were. This is Henry Austen, her favorite brother, the very lively one who married a French countess, started a bank that failed and took down all of his family's savings with it, and was charming and witty, and then he's the one who became a minister in the Church of England, but the evangelical side, because he liked to preach and talk a lot. So instead of just reading the liturgy, he would give what Jane Austen called very lively, witty sermons. Let's see here. Now, she had 2 naval brothers. and the youngest was Charles, who was born in 1779, lived to a ripe old age of 1852, but even though he rose to a very high position in the Navy and lived to be a very old man, he did not outlive his brother Francis, who was born in 1774, lived to 1865, and became a full admiral in Queen Victoria's Navy.
Oh, wow.
And there he is. There's a photograph of him. I don't think Jane Austen probably looked very much like that, but anyhow, that's the only photograph of an Austen family member. Now there is one more child, George Austen, one more male child, one more son. Actually, there are two more. George Austen was born in 1766. They think that he might have had epilepsy or perhaps was autistic, because you don't hear very much about him. He apparently was deaf and couldn't talk. He was mute, and because Jane Austen knew sign language with her fingers. And so this child was placed with a family of, a loving family of farmers who lived close by, and the farm family took care of this child. Now I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but when you remember that the Austen family, they had 5 other children to take care of. He was also teaching about a half dozen boys that they would take into the parsonage as boarding students. He would get them ready for Oxford or Cambridge, the Reverend George Austen would. And he was also steward of the local estate, because the estate owner himself was often away. So here we have George Austen, who was acting as a steward. He was a clergyman in the local church. He was a tutor and had sort of like a boarding school in the parsonage. It was bursting at the seams. He was frantically busy trying to get enough money together just to feed the rest of the 5 children. So to place the child with a loving family who was close by, who could pay attention to the child who needed a great deal of attention as an epileptic or autistic child, was actually far more compassionate than you might initially think when you give it some thought. But that was George. That's not his silhouette. That was simply a silhouette of a young boy. There's no representation in the silhouette or anything of George anywhere. But I never liked for him to be forgotten. Now, the interesting thing is, to illustrate the point of how a clergyman's family could go up or down, or if you were a clergyman's child, you could socially go way up, or you could go down, or you could just sort of stay in the middle. We have the other brothers. So far we have 2 clergymen, 2 Navy members, and we have the autistic child, and then we have Edward. Edward was the son on whom fortune shone, because the Reverend George Austen had very wealthy relatives named the Knights. They were childless, and so they wanted to adopt Edward into their family. And the Reverend George Austen was hesitant, but it was Mrs. Austen who said, "I think you should let the child be adopted. They'll have much better prospects for him than we can offer. They love him. He enjoys their company. He's been to lots and lots of visits with them." And so Edward was adopted by the Knight family. The Knights were rich beyond imagination. And guess who inherited that when the Knights died? It was Edward Austen, Jane Austen's brother. And as a result of Mrs. Austen's rather pragmatic foresight, when the Reverend Austen died in 1805, they had a wealthy brother who could take care of them, and did. This is at the Chawton Estate. This is where I presented a paper on Jane Austen in the Anglican Church. That was the lecture room. It's I think it might have been the library originally. And that's the original portrait that is hanging up there. So I couldn't get all the chairs out of the way, but that's... Now, we come to the young woman of the family, Jane and Cassandra. Jane, of course, everybody knows about. Cassandra was the older sister, quieter, more serious, just like older sisters and older siblings always are. Now with Cassandra, that particular silhouette, and you can see how they provided detail with the folds in her dress and the curls in her hair. That one has been authenticated as genuine by descendants of Jane Austen. This silhouette on the left of Jane Austen was found pasted in a second edition of Mansfield Park in about 1820 or 30 in French with the lovable or the amiable Jane written beneath it. So they think it may be authentic, but they cannot actually guarantee it. But on all of her books and so forth, the silhouette on the left is the one that you will see. Coming along to 1815, just a couple of years before they died, there's some controversy here. The family says this silhouette on the left really is Jane Austen in 1815. A couple of the well-known scholars of the day, Deirdre LeFay, she says no, that's a silhouette from later on in the century, from about 1830 or so, but I really don't know how she can tell. This one has been verified as one of her older sister, Cassandra. So, here we have, this is the portrait of Jane Austen that was completed or that was designed by her nephew when the memoirs came out. And I was making some notes here today, and I was trying to see, it doesn't say, okay. Right. This, I believe, this particular portrait, they tried to sell it at Christie's. No, that's right. It was, this one was the one they tried to sell at Sotheby's. And it was auctioned off at Sotheby's in 2013 for $270,000. Even though this is not really that accurate, it was the portrait that her nephew had commissioned based on a sketch that her sister had done. So that sold for $270,000. But you can see there are some problems with it. I mean, and Jane Austen looks very young there. Most people remember her as a very tall person and who was rather angular and perhaps a little on the wiry side. And this lady looks very plump. And notice what she's wearing on her left hand, on her fourth finger. A wedding band. I mean, can't they even get... it would have driven me crazy if I'd been her nephew, but, you know, she was a spinster. She was a maiden aunt. And so, to even have the ring there is kind of hilarious. So, but that is the portrait that most people see on the flyleaf of their copies of any sort of Austen volume. But this is the portrait that her amateur artist sister did. This is the only authenticated portrait of Jane Austen that is out there. Now, does this lady look like somebody who enjoys sitting for her portrait? No. But I think she loved her sister dearly. She and Cassandra were the closest of friends. And her sister probably pleaded with her to sit for her portrait, and she finally said, all right, I'll do this. But you can see by the expression on her face that she's not enjoying it. Cassandra was an interesting artist. I mean, sometimes she seems to have done rather well. Other times, she seems to have obviously been an amateur. But this is the only official, the only authenticated real portrait of Jane Austen that exists, and that I believe is in the National Gallery of Art, or the National Portrait Gallery in London. This is the only other authenticated portrait that her sister did. And I think the reason that she didn't want to show her face is because here's a clergyman's daughter sitting outside on a warm day with her bonnet strings undone and her skirt up over her petticoat. So it could be any woman of the period, but that was a sketch or a watercolor that Cassandra did and said that was Austen. Now, let's get into some of the portraits that over which there is some controversy. The Rice portrait. There we are, the Rice portrait. Now, the Austens married into the Knight family. The Knights married into the Rice family. And down through the generations, this portrait, which ostensibly was made when Jane Austen was visiting her very rich uncle in Sevenoaks, Kent, supposedly was done about the time that she was 12 or 13. It's a very winsome portrait. The Knight family insists that it is authentic, that it was an original Ozias Humphrey portrait. Ozias Humphrey, if you look him up, he did wonderful portraits of the well-to-do people of the day. And so they thought originally that this could not have been Jane Austen, because at the time they said that style of frock on the young girl was not what was being painted in 1887. Jane Austen would have been 12 and 1787. And so that it was dismissed as not authentic. But we can see that this portrait by Miss Willoughby, oddly enough, by George Romney in 1783 does show a young girl wearing a very similar style of dress. And curators, in the meantime, more and more curators have come to regard the Rice portrait as an authentic portrait. There are still some holdouts, but a lot of scholars and a lot of curators now believe that the Rice portrait is the authentic portrait. Now, this portrait is a portrait that was discovered by Paula Byrne's husband. Paula Byrne wrote a very, very detailed, and I must say a very good biography of Jane Austen. I think it came out about 2013. And her husband said he was just at a bookstall or something, flipping through, and he came across this sketch, and on the back it said Jane Austen. And he was stunned. And he knew his wife was writing this biography about Austen, so he runs it to her, and she has a big press conference. We've discovered a real portrait of Jane Austen, and which is certainly not going to harm the sales of her book in any way. But there are some problems here. I think it almost looks like a portrait done by an Austen enthusiast or a family member or somebody as a sort of mourning or in memorial. Because if you look, I think that's Winchester Cathedral there. You've got this sort of heavy black curtain and this tassel. And then you've got Jane Austen with a cat, on the table. There's just too much there's just too much detail for that to be a Regency. There's a lot, by detail I mean there's too much sort of Victorian additions. You know, a cat on the table, the pen, her frock is very sort of frilly. So some scholars think this may be original. I don't think so, because Jane Austen on the back is spelled Austin. So that's a big red flag for me. Let's see here. Now, this portrait is the James Sternier Clarke portrait. James Sternier Clarke, or possible portrait. James Sternier Clarke was the librarian and secretary of the Prince Regent. And it turned out that her brother Henry was sick in London, and she went to nurse him. It turned out the doctor who was looking after Henry was the royal physician who looked after the Prince Regent, who was acting for King George III, because King George III at that point was completely gaga. So, this portrait was discovered in a book of portraits that he had done of different visitors. James Sternier Clarke took Jane Austen on a tour of the palace and of the library because the Prince Regent was very fond of Austen's novels and had one in each of his residences. And Emma, as a matter of fact, is dedicated to the Prince Regent. She didn't want to do it. She hated the man, thought he mistreated his wife. He had a horrible reputation. But when his secretary said, the Prince Regent gives you permission to dedicate your next book to him, basically that was a royal command and she couldn't get out of it. But she became friends with his secretary, and this portrait showed up in a journal that he had kept, where he kept notes and he kept watercolor. He was a fairly accomplished watercolorist, and he kept watercolors of all the visitors who came to see him who were of any note. This one was the only one, along with one of Princess Caroline, but this one was the only one that was anonymous. There's no name on it, but they think it might be Jane Austen, because if you look just below the lower lip, you see this little black mark. And it's hard to tell whether it's a bit of lace on her cheek or whether her complexion is sort of mottled there. But Jane Austen died of Addison's disease. What famous Massachusetts had Addison? Yeah, okay, I was hoping you would at least get that. I'd be very disappointed. Anyhow, they think that Jane Austen died of Addison's disease, which, you know, is very easily treated with steroids and stuff these days. But back then there was no treatment. They didn't even know what it was. And part of the symptoms of Addison's disease is your skin becomes mottled and discolored. Austen mentions this in one of her letters when she says, "I'm no beauty anymore. My skin is every wrong color, and I don't know what's happening." So that could be a clue that this really is an authentic portrait of Austen. Now, her sister, as I say, was an artist, and Jane Austen herself wrote this spoof of the history of England when she was like 12 or 13. It's absolutely hilarious. It's called The History of England. But her sister probably used her as a model for Mary, Queen of Scots, because Jane Austen was a fan of Mary, Queen of Scots. So there's another indication of what she might have looked like as a young girl. Now, one of the only other really authentic bits of Austen that is out there is this memorial locket that's in the family. It's made of Jane Austen's hair, which her sister snipped just before the casket lid was closed, because women didn't attend funerals back then. So only her brothers and her nephew were at the funeral, but Cassandra was able to get a couple of snippets of hair, and these were very popular as mourning brooches because it's supposed to be a weeping willow. And so that's the only other really authentic thing there is out there. These are some modern representations. Let's see, I can't remember who did that. I can't remember who did that. There's a modern illustrator who did the portrait on the right. I'm not really struck with it, but you know, I'm sure she put her heart into it, and you know, I guess she might have looked like that, sort of. Austen became wildly popular right around 94 and 95, just when I was starting to work on my thesis, and the popularity has not faded since. I don't know why. Nobody knows why. The one thing that's rather frustrating is that, as I mentioned earlier, she's become known as a women's writer. When she, you know, there have been scholars of both genders who have studied her work. There have been, you know, Oxford and Cambridge men who have, you know, written these huge tomes on Austen. I read them. They're boring, but they did write them. And so what I would like to do is to reinitiate interest in Austen among male readers, because, as I mentioned earlier, she's not a romance writer, she's a satire writer. She's really hilarious. As Sue mentioned, you know, I had to read a lot of theology in college, in the seminary. I thought I was going to die. And so 10 minutes before I turned out the light, a friend of mine who knew I was going to seminary, who got through himself, said the thing that got him through was 10 minutes before he turned out the light, he read what he wanted to read, not what he had to read. And I enjoyed Austen so much because she's funny. She's hilarious, you know, she's really, really entertaining. And so that's why I studied her in seminary. Now, there is an actress, a modern day actress, who is a descendant of Jane Austen. But actually, before we get to that, let's see, let's go back here. Let's take a little poll. There we are, that one's real. Now, get back to the question. That one's real, that one's real. How many people here think that that is a real, that's the real deal, that's an authentic portrait? Because the reason I'm asking that is because scholars are split 50-50 on this. So what's your impression? What do you think?
Why not?
Why not? Yeah, well, that sounds pretty good. Very academic. But actually, in some ways, as a child, she was known to have round cheeks, as this girl does. And people do change. I mean, anybody who's watched the Harry Potter movies knows that, you know, people change a lot between the age of 10 and 17. So, given the provenance of the painting, it could be very possible that this is an authenticated portrait of Jane Austen. How many people think this one is the real deal?
Not so
No, okay, poor Paula Byrne. I hope the sales of our books don't plummet. Let's see here. How about this one? Think this one? Okay. All right. Well, you guys have done really good voting. So what we're going to do here is which actress, the actresses I'm about to show you, I'm going to take a vote here. Which actress is a descendant of Jane Austen? One of these actresses is a descendant of Jane Austen. Lucy Scott, who played Charlotte Lucas in the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice. I always thought, you know, Charlotte Lucas was supposed to be this very plain-looking girl, and I always thought Lucy Scott was really very pretty, but she did the role very well. Alison Steadman, who played the over-the-top Mrs. Bennet. Emma Thompson, who played Eleanor Dashwood in the Sense and Sensibility film for which she wrote the screenplay. Anna Chancellor, who played Miss Bingley in Pride and Prejudice, or the actress who played her sister, Lucy Robinson, or Mrs. Hurst. Now, I'll let you go back to the those. Which actress is a descendant of Jane Austen? Uh-huh. There are no prizes here, but there are no failures either, so that's okay. No grade. Who thinks it might be Lucy Scott? Oh, Sue, would you like to take down the numbers?
Sure.
Count those for me.
Yes.
How many people think Lucy Scott? Nobody. Okay. How many people think Mrs. Stedman?
Oh, I like her.
Okay. You think she might be Jane Austen's descendant?
She was an actress.
Okay. All right. We've got one for Alison Stedman. Emma Thompson. Okay. We got, how many do we have here? 1, 2. Ooh, I can't see. I'm sitting down.
3, 4,
Sue's not.
5,
I'll let you
6,
count.
7, 8, 9,
9.
10.
9 for Eleanor Dashwood, 9 for Emma Thompson. How about Anna Chancellor? 1, 2, 3. How about Lucy Robinson? 1, 2, 3.
4.
5.
5. Well, your librarian and the others who voted with her are correct. Oh, that's right. You were at the earlier lecture. Oh, that's no fair.
You can tell them. This one?
Yeah, Anna Chancellor is a descendant.
I know. But I was in the back.
Yes, she was.
Well, now, that pretty much rounds out just about everything I have to present to you on the 10-pound note, the portraits that are possibly Jane Austen, and a little bit about her family and her background. So that's it. If you have any questions, raise your hand and Sue will be happy to take them.
How many brothers? 6?
She had, let's see, she had 6 brothers. Let's see, 2 in the Navy, 2 in the clergy, 1 rich, and 1 sister. So she had 6 brothers, there were 2 sisters, so there were 8 children in the family. And that was not a bad number for that period. Ask me some questions. Try to stump me.
What's your favorite Jane Austen book?
Oh golly, I hate it when people ask me that. There are 6 of them, 6 completed ones. Well, I mean, Pride and Prejudice is just such a masterpiece in and of itself.
It sure is.
But I notice that when I travel anywhere, the pocket copy I take with me usually tends to be Sense and Sensibility. I think it's because I'm traveling and I always want to be as sensible as Eleanor and not do anything stupid. And I love Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility. She's hysterically funny. She's rather unique as a character, Mrs. Jennings, because she's one of the few. Well, if you want to know, if you're reading Jane Austen and a character starts to use bad grammar, that's usually not a good sign in Jane Austen. Like Lucy Steele uses bad grammar. But Mrs. Jennings is different. Mrs. Jennings, her grammar is pretty atrocious, but she's so lovable. She's irritating as heck at the same time, but she comes through in the end and really looks after the girls and takes care of the girls, even though she's constantly trying to get them to marry people. Because as Eleanor Dashwood said, Mrs. Jennings is a wealthy widow who's married off her own 2 daughters and has nothing else in the world to do except marry off everybody else's daughters, which is what she tried to do.
Yenta.
Now, what are some of your
Can we turn the lights back on?
what are some of your favorite Austen characters or books?
This is another subject, but what was her family's reaction to her choice of being an author, and was she able to make a living from it?
Very good. I actually had this in my notes and forgot to mention it. Austen made about, we see, during her lifetime, her books were published anonymously. They were by a lady. Well, not only is that how women published back then, but particularly if you were from a clergyman's family and your connections were all rather wealthy and aristocratic, it was seen as rather coarse to put your name on it. And she also was a shy, retiring personality out when she was not with her family. So she didn't necessarily want her name on it. She made, during her lifetime, she made £600 from her books, and I think that, I calculated that was about $60,000. 60,000 or 6,000 or 60,000. I think it was $60,000. And that was she had 4 novels published in her lifetime. Sense and Sensibility was published first, then came Pride and Prejudice, then there was a huge shock when Mansfield Park came out, because it was nothing like Pride and Prejudice, and everybody hated Fanny, except for people who loved her, and then you had Persuasion, and those were the 4 that were published in her lifetime, and for those 4 published, she made about $60,000 in American modern terms, £600, and which helped the family a great deal because their brother had given them a cottage in Chawton in which the ladies lived. Her mother, her sister, herself, and her best friend, and 1 or 2 servants. I forget why, but the brother was able to give them the cottage and sort of look after their basic needs, but he wasn't able to give them a lot of money. It was tied up in the estate or something. And so the $60,000 that she earned actually helped a great deal. Yes.
She was never married.
No, she was never married.
How could she have descendants?
Well, they are not. They are descendants through her brothers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But Cassandra Austen was engaged to a clergyman who I believe was assigned to a ship as a chaplain. When he got on the ship and it sailed away, cholera or some disease like that broke out and he died. And the captain said later if he'd known that he'd been engaged, he would have never sent him on that trip. Austen family legend has it that Jane Austen had fallen in love with a clergyman as well during a holiday to the coast. They were supposed to meet him at another location. When they got there, they got word that he had died of disease as well. Which, I mean, it's you think you're young and you're hardy, in this day and age you don't die. But back then, you could be young and hardy and still kick off just as easily. So, Jane Austen was engaged to, can't think of the man's name right now, but he was basically the son of the local estate owner. They had grown up together. They were good friends with the sisters, and she was visiting. The man popped the question. She said yes, but the next morning she had second thoughts and retracted her acceptance. A servant was sent to the Steventon Rectory with word that the girls, or maybe they just sent them home in a carriage, I forget, but they couldn't. Anyhow, there was some big to-do, and so the girls were were sent home in a carriage, and the family still remained friends, but Austen thought, I think she initially thought, this is a way that I can help my family. I won't be dependent on them. They won't have to look after me. I'll be able to help them out. But she retracted her marriage acceptance the next morning, and so there was a slight scandal. But yeah, she never got married, and neither did her sister. They had always been very, very close, but after they both lost young men with whom they had fallen in love, seemed like they got even closer together in their devotion to each other. And the nieces said that even though the two women were only in their early 30s, they started wearing the caps. Now, caps were worn only if you were married and if you were of a certain age and not married. So they thought, the nieces thought that their aunts had taken on the middle-aged little cap a little early for their age. But we have to remember as well, back in 1817, 32 was not all that young, so yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts or contributions?
Someone had a question about, we know the Bronte sisters wrote under men's names. Did Jane Austen have to do that too, or did she just use her name?
She wrote anonymously. Yeah, she just a lady. Now her brother, Henry, he was very proud of his sister. So when he was in London and discovered that the Prince Regent had a set of her books in each of his residences, he blabbed all over London that it was his sister. And so it was a secret, but not terribly well kept. Yeah.
Was the books fairly accurate in how they reflected everyday life of that class of people in England?
That's why they were so well received. Because if you remember reading Northanger Abbey, a lot of literature of the period was melodramatic. Hannah More was a very religious writer of the day. She wrote Caleb in Search of a Wife. It was hugely popular, but it was boring. There was another religious writer who wrote something called, Fatherhood Disappointed or something like that. So these were the sorts of novels that were out there. Oddly enough, the Fatherhood Disappointed was overly dramatic. Caleb's In Search of a Wife was just a 200-page sermon. And so Austen was trying to present a solid, uplifting message, but she wanted her characters and she wanted the setting to be absolutely natural and authentic. So that's one of the reasons why her novels were so popular.
Was somebody diagnosed her with Addison's disease, or was that posthumously that they just?
No, that was later on, because nobody knew exactly.
I know, I was wondering how that.
Yeah, but most medical scholars who are also literary scholars think it sounds like Addison's disease, yeah. There's a lot of hot air that's been circulating around here. Thank you all very much for staying away.